Hello, hello. I can't tell if my fellow panelists are in tune yet. That's fine, everyone's here, right? I have the extreme pleasure of being the only in-person person at my panel. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming and participating in what I believe is a very provocative and very interesting topic. Oftentimes, and I say this as someone who's talked to all the other panelists and discussed their visions for what they want to talk about and relay. Oftentimes, when we talk about Roma issues, just like when we talk about any marginalized community, they get reduced to being perceived in perception of pity, or being reduced to marginalized cases that do not take an active part in their societies. I was really happy to be part of this panel because I think it's one of the rare moments where I've seen or heard a proactive approach to dealing with the Roma communities that exist in this part of the world, but this part of Europe, but also the rest of Europe. I'll give a brief introduction to the panel and then introduce the panelists. I'm one of those moderators who does not like to do introductory statements because I feel that slows down the debate, and I feel it'd be much better if we get to the sort of the meat and the heart of the issue as soon as possible. So the main topic here is the EU recovery package. It's good to remind the panelists here, present here, and everyone else that in crisis moments in history, it has been these economic and financial packages that have been, put forth by the strongest nations on this planet, or the strongest financial institutions on this planet, that have helped the world recover. We can think about the New Deal or the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. The EU recovery plan is, or the stimulus plan, is a part of that. It's supposed to be, it is officially the biggest lump of financial support that's being provided to this continent by the EU and in general, with the goal of sort of helping member countries and those outside overcome everything that's been caused by COVID. I think the debate today will be, on one hand, very concrete, but also philosophical. And I say that because these big stimulus packages in the past, like the New Deal and the Marshall Plan, have led to such structural changes in our societies and have injected so much possibility for expansion and inclusion that they've been literally, the history is marked by these plans. The Marshall Plan in Europe was something that was indispensable. The New Deal in the US was something that was indispensable. That's what the EU recovery plan is supposed to be. And my panelists today have the novel, I'd say novel because I haven't heard it before. I'm assuming that they have, among themselves and in their very specific focuses, talked about this before, and that is that this plan should be used to include the biggest demographic group in Europe that is not affiliated with a nation or with a country. The Roma community in Europe is one of those which is present in very many countries, but unlike many communities in Europe, does not have a state or government or an army or political force behind it. And with the proposition of the panelists is that by including the Roma community in this recovery plan, we can, first of all, as a big group, demographically a big group, have a significant injection into the EU recovery plan, but also include a community that has, more harshly than others, suffered the downsides of various financial crises and so on and so forth, especially everything that's happened with COVID. Without further ado, because I'm a journalist, we like to talk a lot, yet I feel that the panelists have so much more interesting things to say. I will briefly introduce everyone and then start with the first question for one of the panelists. The first person I'd like to introduce is Željko Jovanović, who is the director of the Roma Initiative Office at the Open Society Foundations, and is someone who I've been following for, personally, as a journalist, for a long time because of his innovative and new approaches to dealing with Roma issues in this part of the world and elsewhere. I personally like to emphasize his activist efforts following the murder of a member of the Roma community in the Czech Republic, which was very similar to what happened to George Floyd in the United States, yet did not provoke a reaction in similar scope as it did in the US. Something that I hope we'll be able to touch upon tonight. Then I'd like to introduce Tomasz Hagleitner, who is the head of strategy on the Western Balkans and regional strategy at the European Commission, who might not be in your handouts because there's a last-minute change, but who I am very sure will be a productive part of our conversation. Then I'd like to introduce Petru Dulgeru, and I hope I pronounced your name wrong. Name right, I did pronounce it wrong, most likely. A Freudian slip right there. But who I think has a lot to say about the ways in which Roma communities have been involved and been more empowered economically in ways that governments don't foresee and other organizations haven't foreseen. And finally, Dragan Tedovsky, who I've heard wonderful things about, especially as someone who has studied economics, and I appreciate people who know economics well, in the sense that he's one of the rare individuals who's focused on the macroeconomic approaches to dealing and helping Roma communities in general. He is professor at the Faculty of Economics, University of St. Cyril and Methodius in Skopje, North Macedonia. And since we've gotten that out of the way, I'd like to start with Željko. We had a wonderful conversation the other day in preparation for this panel and I'd like for you to sort of try to reiterate what we talked about. As someone who has been dealing with Roma issues, you said to me, I am sick of having to come up with ways to deal with Roma issues where everyone isn't like, oh, look, it's the Roma complaining again. So please enlighten me further, but also the people present here as to what your vision is.
Thank you very much, Roma. I'm very glad that we have this conversation in the context of the Global Security Forum. I'm very grateful to Sonia Licht and the organizers. So the core of the idea that you just expressed and related to our conversation the other day is that for a long time we've seen the situation of Roma as a situation where some people or organization feel pity, or they want to support out of humanitarian reasons, which is good. Some other people, including myself, talked about human and minority rights for a long time, but we came into a very important moment where we have to see what is the interest of our societies and our countries, the interest in having countries that are decent, that respect human rights and minorities and feel solidarity toward everyone in that society. It is also about economic interest. And I'm saying this in the three very important aspects. First aspect is that Europe's economic future is quite grim. Even before the COVID crisis, there are studies that have shown that by even 2025, which is just in 3 years almost, the demand for labor will start to exceed the supply of labor in countries such as Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, and Slovakia. A little bit longer projection for those who are also able to see the interest of the future generations in Europe. By 2050, the working age population will in the EU will decline by 10%, and in Central and Eastern Europe, where the situation of Roma is particularly difficult, it will fall by 30%. So working age population will decline. We already have a shortage of labor. On the other side, In this context of the aging continent and aging societies, we have a Roma population that by its size, which is about 12 million across the continent and 6 million within the EU, the size of Roma population is as such that is at the level of mid-level country. But it's not only about the number, it's also about the demographic vibrancy and youthfulness of this population. Just for example, the number of Roma below 15 years old is 3 to 4 times higher than their peers in majority population. In the Western Balkans, the youthfulness of Roma is even higher than the populations of Albania and Kosovo that are already known for their youthfulness. An example is North Macedonia. Roma under 30 years old are in number almost double bigger than 30 years old population among the majority. In Serbia, by 2035, which is in 13 years, almost 1/3 of new labor market entrants will be all Roma. So when you look at this, you can say, what is the future of Europe and Roma population within it when we have such demographic divergence and potential of the population that is highly excluded right now? And this brings me to the third aspect of this story, is that Roma exclusion already hurts our economies. In other words, racism costs. It is not only an attitude, it has deep implications for our economies. Again, one example, if Roma could find work in the formal economy of Serbia, which is the biggest economy in the region, the gain could go even to 1.2 billion euros per year, which is between 0.9 to 3.5 of Serbian GDP, as this was projected by the World Bank in 2017. When we look also at the fiscal benefits of what do we gain in terms of taxes and what we don't spend on social assistance expenditure, this would add about 300 million euros per year. So when you look at this, you can easily conclude that the case of Roma is a case of investment in human potential, in human capital, in human resource for the benefit of everyone. It is not a matter of charity or pity. It is a matter of rights, because we still live in democracies, or we aspire to be democratic societies, democratic countries, but it makes also a very strong economic case.
I have to react in what I'm assuming is a question that is coming up amongst our audience and those who are viewing us online, and that is, isn't this such a reductionist view of seeing a community where they are viewed only through their very, basic contribution to the labor force? Like, how will this be presented in a way? Is there a way of doing this which will also help and change perceptions of a community wider, in general? So it's not just like these people in the Roma community are participating in the labor force, but how will it actually change, or do you think it will actually change the way the community is perceived, like in terms of prejudices and everything?
Obviously, this is only one point of view, but it has been a point of view that has been neglected. The point of view that we expressed so many times, which is the point of view of solidarity and humanism and rights and equality and justice. We pursued that argument for about 20 to 30 years, depending how you look at it. But in all these countries, since the fall of Berlin Wall, Roma have been a collateral damage because of the transformation of economy and transformation of politics. And where does this has brought us? all these arguments. It brought us to the situation that is only getting worse. It's not getting better. This is obviously not an argument for friends of Roma who already believe in human rights and minority rights and inequality. Of course, absolutely. We have to see Roma as an integral part of societies. We as a community, we already contribute to the societies, even though those societies don't see us, and our contribution should be recognized. But there are also parts of the society that are not concerned with Roma. Unfortunately, more and more not even concerned with the human rights, but they are worried that the economic future of their children will be worse than their own. So that's why we wanted to shed the light on another dimension and another point of view, how we look at the not only opportunity, but necessity of improving the situation of Roma.
I have so many, I cough when I have to ask a question. I have so many follow-up questions for what you just said, but I'd like to transition to another panelist. Petro, can you tell me, we talked, again, you and I also talked about before the panel, tell me what is it like to actually participate in successful initiatives where Roma communities have been integrated into the labor force. And I think one element that you and I discussed was like the empowerment that comes with being a more integrated part of the labor force.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Una, and greetings from Brussels to all of you watching online, as well as to the people in Belgrade. So I fully agree with what Jellico mentioned before. I believe that the economic impact of the Roma populations in the wider society is a key aspect. And I believe the whole approach that governments had in the wider society vis-a-vis the Roma kind of came from the pity and kind of like helping out, providing scholarships or providing social welfare, when in fact what we have to do is provide means so that the parents can afford to build the houses, to get jobs and take the kids to school. And the moment when you actually enable this access to the employment market and you enable people to contribute to the society, then I think that's the moment when you actually show solidarity. And if I can continue on this path, because Jellico was mentioning before about solidarity, I think we are quite bad at this. I think in the past, the only moment when I have seen the wider population showing solidarity to the Roma communities was in the first 2 months of the COVID pandemic. So I think at that point, I've seen a wider network of some of the people I know, but also other people reaching out towards Roma communities because we had this sense of we're in the same boat. I have not seen this sense of solidarity for the second wave, third wave, or fourth wave of the COVID pandemic.
But is it fair to just see, again, as someone who does, is it fair to just see, does it help Roma people Roma communities, if, we force those people who usually aren't very inclined to do this from, the convictions of equality amongst all communities and all that kind of stuff, is it fair to just reduce them to labor potential that the evil, quote unquote, evil capitalists will use because of the terrible demographic decline in Europe? Like, do you think, two things, do you think the Roma communities would like to be portrayed like that? Or do you think it helps the other side understand Roma issues more if they're reduced to that?
I don't know if this helps the Roma community, and I cannot really speak on their behalf, but I can actually say what I have witnessed working with all of the Roma entrepreneurs in the region, in Macedonia, in Serbia, in Romania, and Bulgaria. And what I feel from all of the people that I interact with is that they want to be successful and they want to actually build their businesses, create opportunities for themselves, their families, and the wider community. And recently, I can give you just a quick example. We started a process with the support of the Open Society Foundations, where we started a transition towards the digital for most of the Roma who are selling in the markets. And what they are doing now is they are putting on the social media the whole process of making a product, like, for example, the craftsman.
Yeah.
And not only are they showcasing their products, and they're now able to get in touch with a different market than they used to, but they're actually showing to millions of people, some of them, the amount of effort they're putting in to make something. And I think this is very, very much important, because we need to somehow balance this stereotype that Roma do not want to work. There's so many people that work extremely hard, that wake up 5 o'clock in the morning to get to work at 8, but those are invisible Roma. Most of the people that we see are the ones who are extremely visible in downtown Brussels or in the capitals, but those are really not the majority. The majority are the ones who are struggling to keep their kids in school, to pay for their food, the ones that are recycling on the streets of Skopje and they're being harassed by the police. All of these people who are really making an effort to contribute, first of all, to their families, but also to the societies.
Again, I have so many follow-up questions for this, but we need to include the other panelists. Mr. Tevdovsky, I have a question, I guess, that is at the heart of this panel for you, which is, how can economists, be it from, officials who deal with economics, like ministers of finance and so on and so forth, to like economists who plan sort of investment strategies for European countries and stuff like that, how can they completely disregard such a big population that provides different uses within the labor force? How can they disregard having a specific, how have they disregarded having a specific strategy for them for so long?
Thank you, Una. I want to first to say that it's my great pleasure to participate in this important panel and conference. So first, I want to emphasize two things. Why the Roma population needs increased attention by the policymakers, and especially to be included in the European Recovery Plan. And the second thing is to add some, maybe two more arguments about the benefits of the Roma inclusion to the economy and society at whole, in addition of the demographic argument. First, I will start with, because there is a lot of studies that deals with the situation pre-pandemic, so I will emphasize two things that are well documented during pandemic and influence the Roma population. The first is pandemic impact on education. For example, IMF's fiscal monitor found that learning losses during the pandemic reached a quarter of children's normal annual learning progress in advanced economies. Mm-hmm. And almost this amount is double, so in poorer economies, basically in our region. So this means that they wipe up half of the learning gains during the normal times. And in the report is also highlighted that children from poorer families have been disproportionately affected. And we know that the Roma children not only belong to this group, but they have significant gap in both in attendance and in all level of education. So the second important impact of pandemic is in labor force. For example, International Labour Organization reports found that the lower skilled and younger workers have experienced more job losses than those in higher skilled occupations. Also, disadvantaged ethnic groups and informal sector workers have been harder hit. And we also very well know that Roma population has higher share in informal economy in comparison with the other ethnic groups in I will say now for Balkans, almost half of the Roma jobs are in informal economy. So in the basic of this is that if we neglect these tendencies that happened in the past 1 or almost 2 years, there is a potential to wipe out the achieved, maybe small, but achieved progress in Roma inclusion in the past decades.
If I may interrupt you just briefly, just briefly, and again, I have massive appreciation for economic analysis, which most people don't. So I'm just trying to get the conversation back to what Željko is saying is basically people who planned, economic strategies for a country, financial outputs and stuff like that. They should use the Roma because it's something that is failing from the way they plan economic activity in the country. Can you explain why that was done? I mean, if nothing else, there's so many sectors where there's a lack of work. There are a lack of workers. I feel like that's sort of the heart of the question. Why haven't these communities that live in these countries that are citizens, why haven't they been consciously included into the economic processes?
So I totally agree with Željko's argument. So I will start with his argument, adding something else,
yes,
and then I will provide two more. So first, higher inclusion of the young Roma population in the formal labor market will soften the negative effects of the aging of population in many European countries.
Okay.
This is clear. Also, we in the Balkans especially, we were in the race to the bottom in taxation in order to attract the foreign direct investment. Mm-hmm. But now, in many countries, we are facing limited labor supply due basically to the emigration abroad. So the inclusion of the Roma can improve the prospects in all Balkan countries' labor markets. Another argument is that equal employment opportunities for Roma will generate economy-wide productivity output gains based on formal employment gap and equalization of earning gaps. For example, in my country, North Macedonia, World Bank estimate that non-Roma neighbors earn an average 33% more than Roma. So this is gap only for formally employed Roma. And the share of formally employed Roma is 22% in my country, while 49% of economically active working age Roma are unemployed. So if we translate this in figure, for example, some relevant is of the Council of Europe estimates that the employment of Roma in formal economy and closing this earning gap will lead to output gap. If we close this output gap, we will output gains of around 1% of GDP per year. For example, in my country, so it will be different but positive in all Balkan countries. Yeah. Also, the second argument, additional, is that Roma inclusion would also generate fiscal benefits on both revenue and expenditure sides. How? On the revenue side, primarily channel will be to higher revenues from personal income tax and social contribution from the transformation of the informal to formal jobs. And on the expenditure side, benefits would be in the lower social transfers for the achieved Roma inclusion in the labor market. So these are the economic arguments for the Roma inclusion. And when I start, why it's important now in this moment, the policymakers to have more attention, I must say also two things that start to be clear in the past few months, especially in the Europe, but in the whole world. The first is rocketing of the housing prices all around. So many serious international institutions started to issue analysis, basically warnings, that this very, very strong increase in the housing prices will make housing unaffordable home. Yeah. And the second thing is we are witnessing now the big adjustment in the labor markets this year. in advanced countries, the data that we are seeing is that there is a both big or high job opening and in the same time high unemployment rate. This means that labor market is adjust, and basically labor economists provide many different reasons for that. What is relevant for our discussion is that the pandemic speed up the process of automatization that will increasingly replace many low-skill jobs in the future. So in this moment, especially in post-pandemic world, this is another argument why policymakers must put much more attention of this issue.
Thank you so much for that. Immediately, I'd like to go to Mr. Hageleitner, if that's how you pronounce your name, last name. All these panelists have made very arguments that seem very common sense and very obvious about why this should be done. To what extent has it been done, and to what extent, you know, you've heard them say things that are so obvious and so common sense. Why hasn't this been done more so far, and what can be done with the EU recovery plan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Una, and good evening from Brussels. And first of all, let me excuse again Katarina Matyanova, who couldn't attend due to some urgency tonight. Now, let me, well, there were a couple of questions now about the, you know, how the political, you know, to which extent the political uptake on Roma and how much it is taking into account. And as someone working on enlargement, working on the region, where in general, our way of working is that we sort of export EU policies to the region. I feel, if I may say, that in the case of our Roma policy, it could be a bit the other way around, because I think we're actually quite advanced, and we have quite a focus in our enlargement policy on Roma. And in fact, on both elements, I mean, you raised several times the issue, can it be reduced to economic, you know, gains? Obviously not, and this is the reason why when we talk about Roma, we in our enlargement reports, we deal with the issue and with them and the fundamental rights. That doesn't mean that all the economic arguments should be ignored, and the European Recovery Fund, as you mentioned it, in the case of the Western Balkans, it's called the European Investment Plan, which the Commission adopted last year, which foresees 9 billion euros of EU taxpayers' money, with the potential to leverage 30 billion of investments in the region, 1/3 of GDP. If you look at this plan, you actually have quite an amazing number, as I've reread it again tonight, of references to the Roma community, and that's not by chance, because I think we have to be honest amongst ourselves that the whilst it is not a formal accession criteria, the economic catch-up of the region of the Western Balkans is an indispensable part of the EU accession process. Now, the EU has put a lot of money on the table through the Economic and Investment Plan, but we can bring the money. I think the countries of the region have to look at what they can bring and where their assets are. And as was very, eloquently and with a lot of facts underlined by the other panelists, Roma simply are an asset in this regard. They can play a key role in the economic catch-up of the region, and I think it can not only transform the image of Roma that was mentioned before, but it can contribute to changing the perception of the region in terms of what they are bringing, in terms of their potential. I mean, there is far too much perception within the EU that you know, enlargement, bringing the Western Balkans into the EU is a burden. I think you know, we as EU, but also the countries have to look at what actually they can bring to the European Union, and there the Roma indeed is a big potential, and this goes far beyond the you know, the immediate economic gains. I think it's precisely for the wider society, for the you know, the entire economic development of countries where they can play a key role. And I think it definitely is not, you know, investing in Roma inclusion is a very compensates highly, you know, the costs. It is a very smart choice, and in our view, the governments in the region shouldn't lose this opportunity, and the EU will continue to stand by them in this regard.
I'd like to transition to Željko immediately. Okay, assume I wasn't the person that I am, and I was more conservative or right-wing and stuff, and my reaction to perhaps all that was said tonight would be, why would we, you know, during this period of crisis, economic crisis in particular, at which we haven't seen the full parameters of, it's going to keep getting worse. We've seen energy prices go up and other things, but it's going to get worse. Why would we, you know, set aside money or in, you know, time and commitment to a community that is, again, as a far-right person, for example, to a community that is not worthy of it, to a community that, you know, isn't one that deserves it? How will you counteract that? How will you counteract, sadly, the voices in the EU and wider who will say, well, this is just another way of it's another handout for a community like that?
I think, I think it adds on the pressure that you put on us from the beginning about why we have such a reductionist view, but also the second question where you asked, but how we actually use this labor force. And this argument that you just explained is very often put on us in maybe softer version, which is, look, we don't need to invest in Roma because we will invest in artificial intelligence, robotics, and maybe immigration of qualified labor force, which was already educated and prepared to work. And of course, this counter argument is viable, even if people are not racist, but hide racism, hide. Now, this argument, as I said, is economically viable, but it's politically dangerous.
Yes.
Because imagine we continue the status quo, which might be more likely than a serious transformation of the way we look at the Roma community and invest recovery plan. Where this will lead us? It will lead us to the growing and young population that is spread out Europe, that lives in the conditions of the third world or developing country. And let me just give you a comparison. The percentage of young Roma which are neither in education, employment, nor training is 63%. The worst region of the world that is close to this 63% or closest to the 63% is Central and Southern Asia at 27%. So when you compare young people that are not in education, employment, and training, Roma in Europe, 63%, Central Southern Asia, 27%. When you compare poor population, working poor population that survives on below $1.9 per day, Roma in Europe, 43%, Sub-Saharan Africa, 38%. So when you look at this discrepancy, you have practically social ticking bomb that will just feed interethnic tension, conflict, and it will lead to the the growth of far right and destabilize further our countries, as we have seen in the last 10 years after the financial crisis. Conservatives had this argument, as you just explained, and they responded to the economic recovery after the financial crisis, which exactly followed this line of argument. And where this has led, the situation of Roma is worse. We have far-right parties that grew basically as startups, exclusively attacking the Roma, like you in Hungary, that then evolved in something else.
Slovakia, Ukraine, Poland. Oh, sorry,
Exactly.
mentioning more examples.
Matteo Salvini in Italy, they were first startups that attacked the Roma. Then they attacked others, and then they attacked democratic institutions. So if you're a truly center-right politician that still believes in democracy, even though you have conservative values, whether you're an economic conservative or cultural conservative, you can still see an emerging threat from the right-wing flank of your political ideology. And this is, I think, a danger for everyone. But Roma, as I think Mr. Terdowski and Patrika said, we already work as a community in circular economy, in seasonal work in agriculture and tourism. We already know that in Serbia, the electronic waste market tripled in the last 10 years. And formally speaking, in this market in Serbia, about 500 people are formally registered as workers. While we know from informal data between 5,000 and 6,000 Roma work only in this sector. So just helping these people to formalize, they immediately become budget contributors, they immediately are recognized as workers, and they also have their rights for social protection, employment protection, health protection respected, and they can exercise. So that's why I think that part of the answer to your question, why we haven't done this, of course it is racism that is embedded in the long history of Europe, but there is more than that. Economic model, especially economic model after the financial crisis, that favor big and formal business and impoverished already poor people in poor regions in Europe, low-income workers, as well as populations such as Roma, simply doesn't work. If we deploy the same model in the recovery from COVID, I think we would have quite not only economic prospects in Europe, but political prospects.
Mr. Hageleitner, can you actually explain something? How much of IPA 3 funds are available for Roma issues for the Western Balkans?
There is no precise figure, so I can't give you an absolute figure in this regard. What I mentioned to you before is the absolute, the total amounts of investment that we hope to leverage in this regard. So we do have a number of specifically, support programs that target Roma but I think the bulk, and I think this is key, also for not to perceive the economic and investment plan as a handout that you mentioned before. I mean, the economic and investment plan will very much depend on projects, on investments proposed by the region, and that of course means by definition already that this has to come from the formal economy. This will not go into the informal economy. So very important to get the Roma community as much as possible into the formal economy, and it will be based on ideas, on some of the elements that have been mentioned before, very much mirroring the areas that the EU itself is trying to go towards greener and more digital economies. Now that sounds like a far shot in a way, but I think it is important to go in this direction by with all the tools, and starting with education, with vocational training, to allow the Roma community to, also participate and put forward and take part in this economic transition. So, because that is where the bulk of the investments will be. We will continue having specific programs for Roma support, etc. But the big money will be in investments, in trying to integrate the region into value chains, coming closer to Europe after the COVID crisis. So I think these are the opportunities, and this is will of course look at the Roma dimension when assessing this type of projects. But it's important that this is, the set of mind of the countries of the region, not to look at the specific Roma projects, but to see how the big bulk of the money can be used to foster the inclusion of Roma into society.
Petru, if you were to go and with Mr. Hageleitner and meet, skeptics of, what we've been talking about so far, what arguments will you use to convince them that this was something that would be beneficial for both Europe, but also for Europe economically, but also Europe as a community of nations that looks out for the marginalized groups? What would you, if you had to pitch it to them, what would you do?
Can I also be the skeptic?
You can do whatever you'd like. This is a free country.
No, I wanted to actually share a bit my skepticism, because I think you spin your question on the amount of money available, right? And I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because we've always had money. And actually, member states, I look at Romania, Bulgaria, and the rest of the countries, Hungary, Slovakia, they actually have much more money than what the European Commission provides them. And still the problem has not been fixed. So I don't think it's a matter of having the resources. And I think now Romania has even more. I think Romania itself is getting 30 billion euros from the European Commission in the post-recovery. And I'm actually quite skeptic that the money will be invested to promote inclusion of Roma communities. In fact, I really believe that the post-recovery money will actually increase the gap between the Roma and the non-Roma, because there's no capacity to disperse these avalanche of money in 2 years or 3 years. So obviously member states are going to put this into large companies, into banks, into all of the other things. You're not going to go into a place where people are borrowing 5, 10, 20,000 and you really don't have a mechanism. So I think the major challenge we have at this point collectively is to try to see what can we actually do to obviously fight the effects of the pandemic globally for the whole society, but make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. And I think this is the motto of the European Commission. But honestly, we've been following up with the civil society, supported by the Open Society and the grassroots organization. We've been following up the recovery plans in Serbia and Macedonia, in Romania and Bulgaria. And actually, there are really no measures that are going to support the informal economy. So I think none of the people that have been affected who are working in the informal economy are going to get any sort of support. Small businesses in Roma communities which are so far behind when it comes to access to digital equipment, kids who have not been in school. So I really think it is still not too late to try to think of measures which are specifically targeting these populations, because Željko's vision will never become true, and as well as Dragan's, right, of helping these people reach their potential. I think it's really high time to think of this.
And who's supposed to come up with these visions, with these ideas? Rome politicians, activist groups, specialist groups. Who are the people who are going to materialize this and put it together?
I really think it's very important to have grassroots organizations. I think they're extremely important because they're in touch with the communities. I think organizations like the one that I'm leading are really spending money to fail, and we're not afraid of experimenting and failing to develop models. So I think the role of the civil society, because we're smaller, we have less bureaucracy, is to try different things, to see what works, what doesn't, and then have a partnership with the government in such a way that these models are then scaled up. So I think this is extremely important to have these public-private partnerships included when it comes to Roma inclusion also.
I mean, we've heard so much so far, and obviously, me personally, I have a lot of follow-up questions for all of you, but I think it's high time I'd open up to questions from the public so that people can, after hearing all of this, sort of maybe inquire into things that they would like explained more about all the stuff that we've talked about. So, questions, everyone? Mr. Slavkovic, please.
Thanks. Good evening to everyone. Marko Savkovic here from BFP and the BSF organizing team. Very happy to see you all. These are not my questions. I'm actually asking Sonia's questions because this is a topic that's very close to her heart, and we decided to do it this way, via messages forwarded via Viber. So basically, she has a couple of questions, and I think it's safest to ask Željko and Dragan, Professor Tedeschi, first, and hear their views on it. How should we from Western Balkans actually explain the necessity or advocate for the necessity of including Roma more in the recovery plans? What should be the avenues? What should be the ways? Do we try to somehow get them more involved, more included through regional economic integration initiatives, whatever they may be, whichever they may be? And should we also try, because there's a lot of effort directed at entrepreneurs in North Macedonia, should we try to emulate some of these models perhaps in Serbia and elsewhere? And another question is, I mean, it's really a chicken or egg kind of dilemma, but would you agree that employment is actually key to changing this image that persists for whatever the reason? Thank you. These are the questions. And also, I mean, the other panelists can feel free to answer themselves if they want.
Željko, do you want to go first?
Yes. So the first question is how this message will be heard, and I think Una, this is another formulation of the question you posed even earlier. Mm-hmm. So I think this is one of the ways. I mean, Mr. Tedeschi worked in the government. He knows how the policy making works. Commission is another actor that is directly involved with politicians in the region. I think we have to bring this story to the panel and avenues of policy thinking and policy decisions where people don't expect them. Because until now, we mostly spoke in the context where Roma inclusion is discussed, in the conferences on Roma, in working groups on Roma, in ministries that are related to Roma. But usually, these are not prime decision-making avenues. So when we speak with the Minister of Finance, we speak with European Commission, when we speak with the business community, Chamber of Commerce, ministries for labor and human resource investment, we have to bring this story. And this is why I'm very grateful for BCF to bring this topic where it is least expected. Precisely because we shaped our arguments in the last 20 years on a single message of human and minority rights. We see that in the time when this agenda is in crisis, we have to come up with this kind of argument with the policymakers that are most concerned with the priorities of these countries, which are mostly right now in the domain of economics. That's why we are approaching this story from this angle, and I completely agree with Sonia and all others like Pierre Mirel, who speak about investment in employment. We do this with Petrica Dovedo through the self-employment and entrepreneurship. But the World Bank has shown that the return on investment in secondary education and vocational training is about 330%. So this is a way to go if we want to see the return, and also we have to understand how to reform the policy that regulates formalization of business, because as Petrica said, Roma who are already employed or they work, they are not in the spotlight. They are busy working, and they are not seen on the streets of Western European capitals or capitals in the Western Balkans. You know, people see us as beggars, as lazy people, and so on. This is the counter narrative. We already work, but we need help to get formalized. Otherwise, as Petra said, we will be wiped out. On the other hand, to invest in secondary education training, because this is the faster route to prepare people for employment, especially employment in the digital transformation.
Professor Tedeschi, do you want to take over?
Yeah, only Dragan is fine. So many thanks for the question. I must say that I finished postgraduate studies in Belgrade, so I'm very sorry that I'm not there. I love Belgrade. I agree very much with what Željko said. I personally, as an economist, believe that the key, if we want a long-term change, significant change, the key is in education. So yes, the civil rights are important, but if you want to see the progress in the knowledge and skills, I think that the countries, but also the international community, must invest in quality of education in the Roma communities. It means in the kindergartens, in the elementary schools, in the quality of education there, because if we want a more productive labor force, especially, so only way is education. So one part of the question was about the employment. Yes, employment is important, but employment, for example, in circular economy or short-term improvement of the skills, it's only on some transitional period. So it is not to create a long-term solution. We need to think strategically, and only way is the countries and the international community to increase the investment in the tangible assets, in real quality of the education that the people will receive. And also, because I'm an economist, I force these economic arguments, but when I read, I must also emphasize the discrimination. So the panelists also said, but I will just mention what World Bank, for example, very credible, one of the best credible international organization, they found that, for example, before pandemic, Roma who had looked for a job in 5 years before pandemic were asked if they experienced discrimination during the process, and 1/3 of respondents answered yes, that they faced the discrimination during the hiring process. So I very much believe in the economic arguments, but I'm aware that this discrimination element exists, and we we must discuss, and I think that this conference is the right way, but this must be maybe more aggressive and more present all around in our region, in order people to be much more aware of the negative consequences. And I also agree with Željko. I'm afraid that post-pandemic world, which we are seeing now, that there is a danger of discrimination and of very nationalistic policy are not decreasing, but are strongly. There is a chance to be much heavier.
I believe that's. Any other questions? First row.
Good evening to everyone. Alexander Breza, I'm a journalist working with the Euronews English. I have a question for Mr. Hagleitner. I'm sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your surname. From the European Commission. I'm kind of curious. For several years, I was a EU correspondent in Brussels covering the Western Balkans. In the Western Balkans, I've also tackled Roma issues, questions, specifically, mostly in Bosnia, but also elsewhere. And what I'd like to ask you is related to the kinds of partners that the EU Commission has so far, and EU institutions in general, have so far looked for in the Western Balkans in particular, but also in the rest of Europe when it comes to, Roma issues. And in my experience, or something that I've seen and noted, especially talking with Roma activists, etc., is that the European Commission tends to find partners that are not necessarily always in touch or in tune with the needs of the community, tend to be large organizations who easily fulfill certain requirements. You mentioned the IPA funds, and I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about. Are you going to try and change that? Are you going to look for Roma-led initiatives, organizations, etc., in the Western Balkans, like I said, specifically, but also in the rest of Europe this time around, now that you have, what, 12.4 billion euros at your disposal? Thanks.
Go ahead.
If I may. It so happens that we have a bit more influence of how we spend EU money in candidate countries than in EU member states, just to, because Mr. Dulgero mentioned his concerns that the recovery funds in Romania might not be spent, might get too many in for the Roma community. We have a bit more influence in the way we can influence this through our instrument for pre-accession. But the one point in response to what you said is also to I think what we need to and what we are looking for as well is to try and really mainstream the way we are trying to support Roma communities, because the bulk of the funds, and I think that's also important to understand, will not come as direct grants and subsidies to some organizations. It will come as guarantees to financial institutions, for example, that use these guarantees to then, offer affordable, cheap, attractive loans, and that is not targeted at any particular group necessarily, but it requires people who have the capacity, the potential to bring forward projects, and even small ones, and we will be looking at small ones as well, to take these up. And I think that is the key challenge, and I think something people need to understand as well, that this money that's available, it will not just flow. It's not that someone in Brussels presses a button and the money goes. It will require people on the ground to prepare, bankable projects that that can be funded. I can commit on our side is that we'll be looking very carefully that these projects take into account the objectives that we've set out in the economic and investment plan, and they set the inclusion of Roma in the labor market, helping on the digital and green transition, and really, I do believe this is, this is the way to look at it. Where can the contributions also of the Roma community in this regard come from? It might look a bit unorthodox, but I think that's the way how the support could best materialize, and that's where the biggest potential is. But again, it's not about waiting for someone in Brussels to provide a check of money. That's not how the economic and investment plan will work. It will be based on projects developed on the ground.
Okay, more questions? Thank you so much. We have, please.
You hear me? Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Marina Vasic, Council of Europe Roma and Travelers team. At the beginning, I would just like to greet all the panelists, especially Željko and Petrika, whom I had the pleasure to work and know for several years. I would like to, at the beginning, maybe just comment on the last question and last comment, because it's very relevant for the context of the Council of Europe and the programs that we have been running and currently running together with DG NEAR. I wouldn't really agree that there is no touch with the ground when it comes to the funding from European Commission in the region. At this moment, we are having a large-scale intervention. Funded by DG NEAR, implemented by the Council of Europe, which is a big organization. But the structure of our programs speak maybe against this criticism, because we do have Roma-led organizations which are part of our structures and in each of the beneficiaries of this program. We are working on the promotion of good governance and Roma empowerment at local level, so we are working at this moment in 80 municipalities. We are having in most of the cases Roma-led organizations, or as Željko would say, Roma-friendly organizations, which makes a lot of sense in this context. We are having grassroots movements of almost 200 facilitators. 80% of them are Roma from the communities, and they are exactly this what we are trying to change, this narrative of putting Roma as agents of change and trying to correct this narrative. When we talk about a lot of issues, I would just say that throughout the work that I have been doing with the Council of Europe in the past almost 8 years, we have had not only with DG NEAR but with different Directorate Generals programs implemented by the Council of Europe, and most of them, they had this structure. And this is one of the values of the Council of Europe, that we are trying to engage and put in the center of the action exactly the target group of all these programs. I have to say that throughout the years I have gotten tired of observing Roma only through the lens of poverty and attaching poverty as part of Roma identity, which is definitely not. What we should actually do, if you ask me, in our language we say we restart the game, and maybe talk less about the issues and maybe promote more the potential of the Roma. If we are only talking about the issues, and numbers are important, but if we are using them only to reinforce what is actually bad in the society when it comes to Roma issues, we will never be able to make the mainstream society look at Roma as potential. That's only as a collateral damage, as Željko said at the very beginning. And we have a lot to be proud of, especially in the past 10 years. If we see, we have Redi, for example, who is having innovative initiatives with entrepreneurs in the region. We are also having with Open Society Foundations and with Rio, all these grassroots movements which are really bringing out change. It's really not easy. It's very difficult when there are so many heavy narratives in not only the region but in Europe that you need to fight against. And especially when it comes to Roma economic empowerment. I agree it's very important, but yet again, it's a very general concept which you cannot, you can understand it in different ways. Maybe it brings more questions than answers. And if we are still continuing with this narrative of being a collateral damage in the society, I don't think that we can reach much further. So that's why I think through all our programs and initiatives, and there are many, if you compare what happened 10 years ago and now, there are so many initiatives that really push against this current narrative of seeing Roma only as a collateral damage. Thank you.
I wish I'd had you earlier on in the conversation so we could include that. I'm going to sort of get a couple more questions, even though we're running close, just because I feel like there's a bit of a conversation to be had. Questions, questions, questions. Front, and then two more over there, if I'm not mistaken, right? One, well, you, and there's someone next to you.
I have a brief question, although I think it's a question that could itself be its own panel, so hopefully I won't make things go too long with it. As a journalist working in, well, obviously in English language outlets, international media, what can we do, or what should we do with the kinds of stories that we could write about the Roma population in your Roma communities? What, in the opinion of the panelists, are some of the best ways to go about covering the issues, covering the role of Roma in recovery in a way that doesn't just fit into sort of the cookie cutter kinds of articles that we are probably, unfortunately, all used to seeing in English language media? In other words, how can we, I mean, the we in terms of the English language journalists, how can we break out of this mold and help leverage whatever influence we have to contribute to the situation positively, rather than just repeat the same stories over and over again? Thanks.
Is there anyone who wants to take that question? Jacob, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, much related to what Marina Vasic just explained. The younger generation is obviously tired of the typical stories of poverty and misery in the Roma communities. I think we need the stories of talent, stories of effort, stories of contribution, stories of finding a way forward when everybody else sees no way. So I think there are lots of stories. As Katrika said, they are invisible, and especially in the Balkans, where we had quite a difficult and bloody history in the last 20 years, where Roma were kind of in between of interethnic conflicts on all sides. We still kept ourselves peaceful. We haven't engaged in any kind of violence for our own cause. And we still pursued the path of hard work and dedication to our families, to our neighborhoods. Many people speak about the founder of Open Society Foundations, where I work, Mr. George Soros, as the one who helped Roma education because of the scholarships and setting up of a Roma education fund. I always say Mr. Soros wouldn't be able to do that without the effort and dedication of Roma parents, or often families of Roma children who are at least two generations working for that child to go to school, grandparents as well as parents. That's the story we have to tell. That's the story that has been unheard. And that's the story that underpins the whole argument that we have tried to shape here, which is the argument of the potential, argument of opportunity, argument of talent. But we need the support, as anyone else, to flourish, because we get the support from the state when we need the state the most. And this is exactly the moment in which we are now impoverished after 30 years of transition and facing the most difficult challenge in the last 100 years, which is the pandemic that will cause the economic chaos and deprivation. But communities that were mostly, as Dragan was speaking about, pushed into the informal economy after we lost jobs in state-owned enterprises during communism and socialism, we found ourselves in the informal economy. Mm-hmm. That is the work that is already there, but we need to help it grow and be sustained throughout the crisis.
Such a wonderful answer. I'd love to get just one more question. I know we're a little bit over time. Yes, go ahead, please.
Test. Good evening, Mate Agatonovic, journalist. This is a question directed at Mr. Jovanovic. He spoke about the great return on investments in case of secondary education and how good of an effect it has on individuals and therefore the community. But we have data points that show that Roma population en masse does not enter secondary education. The numbers of them that are finishing the primary schools in urbanized communities, the periphery of Belgrade, for instance, are also dismal. So how do you bridge that gap between, because they are not leaving the educational system of their own volition, they're usually doing that to provide for themselves, for their families. They're entering at this informal workforce, usually as minors, actually. So how do you bridge that gap between the existing poverty and secondary education, vocational trainings that would actually help the Roma community?
Thank you for the question. This is probably the most difficult one because the efforts on the issue of education of Roma have been perhaps the most invested in, and we can see results in the level of tertiary education. We have unprecedented number of Roma students across the countries. Just one small number, small example is the number of university scholarships that were given by Roma Education Fund. To our account, more than 10,000 scholarships in the last 15 years, which in the context of Roma is significant. We never had before so many students. At the same time, this is the problem of scale. That we have good projects on education, we have good practices on education, but the governments have not scaled them up through the education system, so we can see how they impact hundreds of thousands of Roma throughout Central Eastern Europe as well as Western Balkans. How you bring children back to school is, of course, a difficult question because these children live in the families and environments in deep poverty. And of course, the answer cannot be only in education. It has to be holistic in the domain of social welfare, social protection, and all that requires public expenditure and revenues. And here is where the problem comes, that most of the politicians use the argument similar to the one that Una asked previously. Why would we do it? Some even go to the level to say Roma actually don't want to go to school. Roma don't value education, and this argument is generalized. Even though, of course, there might be individuals who don't value education among the Roma, as there are individuals who don't value education among non-Roma. Moreover, when you see that Roma children and youth who graduated secondary education or university is still unemployed, then you wonder, what is the point of education if even when we are educated, we don't get a job? And that's a macroeconomic question. The answer is not specific to Roma. What is specific to Roma is the degree of racism that makes already a big problem bigger. So that's why I think answer to your question cannot be only in the domain of education. It has to be part of the education reform as well. But we do not see the readiness right now in the public among the public authorities, Dragan was Minister for Finance, also among the ministers of finance, because they need to cut expenditures to finance the crisis, to finance the recovery. And what we're trying to explain here is that this is not a public expenditure. This is a public investment. This is not only a matter of inclusion, it is a matter of public investment. This is why we insist so much on this, because there, as I said, there is a population that exactly lives in the conditions that you described, but there are also lots of people who already work. Let's help them to be working and at least sustaining their own income, because by doing that, they will be able to help the children go to school on their own and will not necessarily require so much public investment.
I think we have to wrap it out at that. That was wonderful, Željko, and thank you to all the panelists for really trying to shed light on and crack open the debate on an issue that I feel could literally be discussed for hours and days on end. Thank you, everyone who came to this evening panel. With that, I can wrap it up. And a big round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you.